Good day and welcome to part 2 of my ranking the top 20 Australian Prime Ministers. Last episode we did numbers 20 through to 11, and just for a quick little roundup, if you haven't watched it, go watch it first. But if you've already watched it and you're trying to, I can't remember. Number 20 we had Fadden, 19 we had McEwen, 18 we had Gorton, 17 we had Turnbull, 16 we had Morrison, 15 we had Fraser, 14 we had Gillard, 13 we had Abbott, 12 we had Hughes, and 11 we had Rudd. Now today is number 10 through number 1. If you don't know what we're doing here, and this is your first time here, first of all, go watch the other one first. And if you don't really want to do that, I'll explain it. Basically, me and my team, and by team I mean one person who'll get shouted out at the end, don't you worry, has ranked all the Australian Prime Ministers, well, the 20 best Australian Prime Ministers. The reason it's 20 is all explained in the first video. I want to get this done, because this is going to be a longer one, because there's more to say about these guys. These are arbitrary rankings. I don't know. I personally haven't ranked them. My team member has. So if you have any issues with it, comment below, because I could get him to respond to it, or or he won't. I can't control him. He's fucking insane. But anyway, let's get into it with number 10, Howard. John Howard, 1996 to 2007. He's a bald man in glasses. He was personally descended from convicts. One of his ancestors was sent to Australia for stealing a watch. He had massive eyebrows, much like Pompidou, the French president, and the man of eyebrows, Brezhnev. Look at this synergy on the channel. He's an Anglophile, monarchist, and a conservative right-wing man, and he's a devout Christian, and he's a massive cricket fan, and he's great pals with George W. Bush, and he's the second longest-serving PM after Menzies, and he's the oldest living former Australian Prime Minister, hopefully still alive by the time this video comes out. He doesn't really need to do much, because the economy was in a good shape when he took over. Very active in foreign affairs, however, very into the war on terror. Has to battle against Pauline Hanson, who is essentially Nigel Farage on steroids. She is very against ending the White Australia policy. He appeals to the striving working class who are more aspirational about themselves. Has tight immigration policy, strong law and order policies also. Wins 4 elections but loses the 5th, and actually also loses his own seat. More humiliatingly, he gets nominated by Australia and New Zealand to lead the International Cricket Council, but he gets rejected. And that is number 10, Howard. Number 9, Holt. Not Captain Holt, Australian man Holt. Harold Holt, from 1966 to 1967. Holt is one of Australia's great mystery stories in the country's history. His ancestors descending from Birmingham. Potentially, his family are Villa fans, or Birmingham City. He went to a boarding school in Melbourne, and he had been Australia's youngest elected MP in the early 1930s, and was a protege of Menzies. Regarded as one of Australia's great Labour ministers, got on well with the leaders of the trade unions. He became the treasurer and was very pragmatic. He becomes PM after Menzies and is very enthusiastic about the Vietnam War. So much so, he triples Australia's troop commitment. Goes into the White House and famously says, "Roll the way in, LBJ," which Aussies find terribly servile and incredibly demeaning. They both got lashed, which, if you don't know, is another way for pissed, by the swimming pool at LBJ's ranch in Texas. They essentially just sit around, eat barbecued meat, drink beer, swim, get hammered, and talk about and look forward to their triumph in Vietnam. Harold Holt is a great guy who loves the beach, and he loves a good old swim. And before Christmas 1967, Holt goes for a swim off the Victoria coast. The Chevet Beach, which is renowned for its tumultuous tides and rips. He is never seen again. His friends he went with come back to shore and get picked up, but Holt vanishes. Possibly he even drowned. Another theory, however, is he had been spying for the Chinese all along and been picked up by a Chinese submarine and taken to China. So here's the rough theory. He was recruited as a Chinese agent as a young man. Originally, he thought he was going to spy for the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist. But then sometime in the 50s or 60s, his handlers revealed he was recruited as a spy for the communists. When he became PM, the theory goes that the Chinese decide he was in danger of being found out, so they sent a submarine to lurk off this beach. Holt swam out to the submarine, was picked up, and spent the rest of his days happily eating Chinese food. A succulent Chinese meal, rest in peace, in China. Despite his wife saying he hated Chinese food, so not too succulent for him. The theorist who comes up with this theory is Anthony Gray, who had himself been taken prisoner in China, so he potentially may have seen him in China, or he was driven so mad and became such a lunatic from this incarceration he invented the story. Another theory claims he was killed by the Viet Cong. This has not been padded out enough to corroborate. The greatest detail about Holt is that the memorial to him is a swimming centre. That's funny. They did that deliberately. The Holt Memorial Swimming Centre in Melbourne still stands to this day, and to be honest, looks like a fantastic pool to swim in. However, we're not going to swim in it because you may drown or get picked up by the Chinese in a submarine. Australians are jumping headfirst in this pool as we currently speak. Drad? Nah, mate. Let me get in there. And that is Holt, who comes in at number 9. Number 8, Barton. Edmund Barton, 1901 to 1903. Now, he was the first Australian Prime Minister, and he was embroiled in a cricket scandal. In 1879, he umpired the match known as the Great Sydney Riot, played at the Sydney Cricket Ground. It was New South Wales versus Lord Harris's English touring team. The English were winning, and one of the two umpires gave out Billy Murdoch, an Australian batsman, and Barton diffused the situation by saying that the umpire's decision is final, but did it with grace and dignity and earned himself a lot of respect. I don't know shit about cricket. The person that wrote this loves it, so hopefully that's important and understandable. The people vote to federate Australia into one country, primarily out of fear of China invading them and taking over Britain. Barton had a phrase, a nation for a continent for a nation, and gave franchise to women in 1902. And that is Barton, who came in at number 8. Number 7, McMahon. Now, not related to Vince, not related to Shane, not related to Stephanie, or Hornswoggle, a different McMahon. William McMahon from 1971 to 1972, arguably the most boring man in Australian politics, described in the Australian Dictionary of Biography as being a blend of innovation and fundamental orthodoxy. That's very boring. However, he was also described by Go Whitlam as Tiberius on the telephone. He was a very dapper man, very dandyish, and there was a suspicion that he was gay because he got married very late in life. LGBT websites in Australia do list him as Australia's first gay Prime Minister. He was voted as Australia's worst Prime Minister, which goes against his arbitrary ranking, clearly. Laurie Oakes stated that McMahon was devious, nasty, dishonest. He lied all the time and stole things, basically like Vince. Wrestling references in an Australia ranking. Who'd have thought? He goes on to describe this incident where McMahon came to his radio station to give an interview, stole a tape recorder from them. When he was challenged, all he simply said was, "This is mine, I own it," despite the fact he did not, and it had the name of the radio station engraved on it. He's a master criminal, an LGBT hero, and the poster boy for diversity, and that is William McMahon, came in at number 7. Number 6! Another two-termer, Menzies. Menzies. If it's wrong, oh no. Menzies. Robert Gordon Menzies from 1939 to 41, the first time, and then the second time from 49 to 66. So he did loads. So here's his doing rough chronological order. He's a stand-up guy, intellectual and not greedy, not personal ambition in terms of finances. Arguably the Prime Minister most associated with Australia and the Second World War. He's from rural Victoria and is obsessed with cricket, showing his intelligence. As mentioned previously, the man who wrote this loves a bit of the cricket, home run and that. First Prime Minister to have Australian parents, with both his parents being born in Australia. His self-deprecation was that he was British to the bootstraps, as he was obsessed with Britain, the royal family, and British traditions. His last name is actually pronounced Mingus, as it is a Scottish last name, and one of his nicknames was Ming the Merciless. Although he liked cricket, he was atrocious at the sport himself. His middle name comes from the fabled General Gordon, a British officer in the Crimean War, and he's a huge fan of Aussie rules football. Becomes a politician in the United Australia Party in 1934, resigns from the cabinet moments before World War II over defence spending and the postponement of the National Insurance Scheme. He said, "People throw mud at me everywhere I go. I'm trudging through a trench of mud." Very popular PM in Britain, and people are talking about him as a replacement for Churchill. There was a belief at the time that a Commonwealth Prime Minister would be able to step above the partisanship of British politics. One of the reasons he goes to Britain a lot is not just to maybe become Prime Minister of Britain one day, but to also ensure that the British High Command do not forget about the Pacific theatre of the war. Menzies loves the Anglosphere and the Commonwealth of English speaking nations, and there is a famous account of him travelling to Ottawa, Canada, and staying up late with the Governor General, showing him all his travel stamps, which is quite a sweet thing, really, even though the Governor General was desperate to go to bed. He's away from Australia for over a year, and when he comes back, he's not clued up enough on what has been happening domestically and gets politically assassinated. Not murder, just character. He wants to go on another trip as PM to Britain to become the PM of Britain, but he needs the permission of the Australian Labour Party to do that, and they do not, which kills him politically. Or so it would seem. We will see later. Anyway, he claims, "I've been done. I'll lie down and bleed a while." After throwing Australia wholeheartedly into World War II, gets kicked out 2 years later. Now, this is all information from his first Avago. Second Avago from 49 to 66. He plays the anti-communist card very well and wins the election against Chifley. Announces the death of Chifley at the 50th anniversary of the Federation of Australia dinner and says, "It's my very sorrowful duty during the celebration tonight to say that Mr. Chifley has died. I don't want to try to talk about him now, because although we were political opponents, he was a friend of mine and of yours and a fine Australian," which shows the mateship they had in Australia. Initially, came back to politics in 1942 and makes a speech about the forgotten people. Here's the speech. "I do not believe that the real life of this nation is not found either in the great luxury hotels and the pretty gossip of so-called fashionable suburbs, or in the officialdom of the organised masses. It is to be found in the homes of people who are nameless and unadvertised, and who, whatever their individual religious convictions or dogma, see in their children their greatest contribution of that to the immortality of their race." And this speech struck a massive chord with the middle class voters, almost a parallel to Richard Nixon's silent majority speech, except Menzies did it 30 years prior, because he's better than Richard Nixon. Australia becomes a very stubborn society in mid-century, the 50s and 60s, and so a lot of anticipatory politics grew, focusing on topics such as home ownership, individual rights, and personal freedoms, etc. At this point, young intellectuals in Australia view Menzies in the same way that young intellectuals in America view Nixon, the embodiment of everything they hate, oppressive, stuffy, and parochial. As a result of this, a lot of prominent left-wing politicians and people fled the country and the complacent conservative affluent society to come to England, with the irony being that Menzies is a massive Anglophile and so is modelling the country off Britain at the time. In 1954, Menzies is up for re-election and is projected that he's going to lose, and then suddenly the Petrov affair crash lands into Australia. Vladimir Petrov was a KGB officer and he was hanging out in Australia. Decides it's a lot nicer than Moscow, so defects, stating that "I no longer believe in communism as I have seen the Australian way." He forgets to inform his wife, or so it is believed that he forgets to inform her, and Soviet goons get her on a plane in full view of Australian media and cause a scene. The plane has to refuel at Darwin, and when it arrives, the Australian Secret Service managed to secure her safety. This pays off massively well in Menzies' favour, and enables him to overcome the odds and win the election. There is a conspiracy, though, that Menzies timed that announcement of Petrov's defection to sway voters in the election, But this is how the game of politics is played, and then haters are gonna hate. However, the consensus is that it was Australian Secret Service who announced it and chose the timing of it. The bigger question is, though, how did Petrov feel when he sees his wife brought to Australia? He might have been incredibly gutted when the Australian knock on his door and tell you, "We got your wife, mate." I digress. The scandal has a knock on effect, and Menzies' primary appeal to the public during and after the election is anti communism, and keen to play the anti communist card, providing explanations why Menzies signs Starley up for the Vietnam War, is very keen to play an anti communist card, providing explanation why Menzies signs Australia up to the Vietnam War. And he is so keen, in fact, he fabricates an invitation from the South Vietnamese government asking for Australian troops, which they later denied. Domestically, Menzies starts dismantling the White Australia policy and begins immigration reform. He steps down in 1966 and becomes the Warden of Southports in England, a ceremonial position which defends Britain's ports from smugglers. It's easy to argue that Menzies was absolutely over the moon when he got this appointment, and he's a massive Anglophile and was enabled to wear these comical hats. He gets a knighthood from the Queen in 1977 at the Ceremony of the Ashes at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, and that is the life, the facts of number 6 with Menzies. Now, coming in at number 5, we have Curtin. John Curtin, from 1941 to 1945, he was Australia's great wartime Prime Minister, member of the Australian Labor Party also. His parents are from Ireland and he's Catholic. He was a solid batsman, which I'm pretty sure is cricket related, despite his eyes. Trade unionist, and is very much so on the left of the union movement as a young man. He's practically a Marxist as a younger man. He's anti-imperial and he's anti-war. For the Russian Revolution, Australia is undoubtedly the most left-wing country in the world, which provides reason for all these left-wing politicians. Anyway, as I digress again, he votes against conscription in World War One, moved to Perth in Western Australia, and becomes much more moderate in his political beliefs during the interwar years. Becomes a prime minister when the Pearl Harbor attack happens. Therefore, he makes a declaration in December 41 stating that Australia will now look to America in the fight against the Axis. And that's also partly because he believes the British sold out Australia by not helping them in the Pacific theatre, focusing entirely on the British Isles. The fall of Singapore after the Pearl Harbor attack is so calamitous to Anglo-Australian relations, as it shows that Britain is not focused on helping the Pacific. It makes tensions worse. Churchill explicitly says that India is more important than Australia to the empire, which angers Curtin. He doesn't hate on Britain. He says that we are descendants of people who have come here to establish in the South Seas an outpost of the British race. He just believes that Britain has betrayed their trust. Curtin has to go against his personal beliefs of anti-conscription, as there were vast multitude of American conscriptions protecting Australia and very few Australians in relevance to this. He dies in July 1945, just as the war was about to be over. He slammed the door on his Catholic faith, and this is proven as when they brought a Catholic priest in to see him on his deathbed, he says, "Go away, mate," and then he died. And that was number 5. Curtin. Number 4, top 4 now. Mount Rushmore of Australian Prime Ministers. We have Chiefley. Ben Chiefley from 45 to 49. And he's regarded by Australians as one of Australia's greatest Prime Ministers. He's a Clement Attlee of Australia, from Irish descent and from New South Wales. He's a Labour Party man and an engine driver. Fascinating. He gets involved in unions at a young age. He's the Defence Minister in the early 30s, but lost his seat. After this, he's dependent on his wife's earnings to survive, but makes it back into Parliament in 1940. By the following year, he's become the Treasurer, equivalent of the Chancellor of Exchequer, and succeeds Curtin following his death. He has lots of fiscal discipline and is a bit of a financial wizard in running the Australian economy. He was a very patriotic man, which is very reflective of Clement Attlee in Britain. Invited to dinner with King George VI, but can't go as he doesn't have any evening dress to wear. The king tells him not to worry, and they have dinner in lounge suits together. Loses the election in 1949 because he wanted to nationalise the banks, which was a step too far for the Australian electorate. Dies a couple of years later in 1951. He might have had an affair with his secretary and also the secretary's sister. He shares the same scandalous side as the German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder and many of the other French presidents, except Holland and Pompidou. They were innocent. And that was number 4, chiefly. Now coming in, number 3, bronze medal. We have Whitlam. Whitlam, not to be mistaken for absolute shithole in Essex, Whittam was Prime Minister from 72 to 75. Quite a patrician figure. Brought up in Canberra. His father was a human rights lawyer, the Crown Solicitor, and then the Commonwealth Secretary General. He studied law at Sydney University and also did the classics, which he was taught by Enoch Powell, the youngest professor of Greek in the whole Commonwealth. However, Whitlam was taught that Powell's teaching was boring. As opposed to presumption, Whitlam actually supported the Labour Party as opposed to the Liberal Party. Attends a parliamentary reception in 1945 with the Queen, and he was the only one who wore white tie and tails while everyone else wore lounge suits. Very similar to Tony Blair and the kind of rise to power Blair had. Manages to secure the suburban middle class voters as well as the traditional working class blue collar voters. In the election campaign of 72, he gets a young Rupert Murdoch to back him, who at this point owns Australian, which is Australia's only national newspaper. He shows a capacity to take dramatic and unexpected steps. For instance, even before Nixon does it, Whitlam goes to China to meet Zhou Enlai as a Labour Party leader, not as PM. Very charismatic figure, very fluent and very self-confident. He was effective at capturing the spirit of optimism, regeneration, and rejuvenation, but wasn't a details man. Much more broad brush with his politics. His slogan was, "It's time." He abolishes conscription, pulls the troops out of Vietnam, and makes a move towards universal healthcare, equal pay for women, and sets up the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. Under Whitlam, white Australia comes to terms with the injustices that historically have been dealt with towards the natives of Australia. He abolishes the sale tax on condoms. That's quite funny. In 1973, the Queen opens the Sydney Opera House, which at the time was very controversial as it was over the budget allocated. His whole agenda, bright, optimistic, progressive, gets undone by the Arab-Israel war and the oil shock that comes from it, as there was now a need for austerity. He didn't want to inflate the economy, raise taxes, or do many of the solutions to the grim consequences of this massive injection of inflation into the world economy. Whitlam decides to do some dodgy stuff by asking the Minister of Energy, Rex Connor, to see if he can get a loan of $4 billion from the sheiks in the Middle East. The opposition gets wind of this, and Murdoch betrays Whitlam and stabs him in the back. There were two halves of the Senate elected at different times. Half of the Senate was dissolved because Whitlam needed a majority in the Senate to get his plans through, and he didn't have this. The Liberal Party and their allies held a majority in the Senate. Malcolm Fraser, leader of the Liberal Party, uses his majority to block Whitlam's government from doing anything. Whitlam decides to avoid doing an election and figure that he'll be able to see it through, as he A, believes that this is a constitutional outrage, and B, 70% of Australian public believe that what the Senate is doing is wrong, and C, Whitlam believes that the Governor General, the Queen's representative in Australia, Sir John Kerr, is still a Labour supporter. However, Whitlam doesn't realise that Kerr's beliefs have changed, and Kerr decides to side with Malcolm Fraser against Whitlam. Whitlam goes to Kerr and asks him to sort out the problem, and Kerr simply says, "You're sacked, mate. Get out of here." Whitlam behaves very well and accepts this and doesn't fight it. A lot of people believe that the CIA had worked with Fraser to get rid of Whitlam. After leaving, he became Australia's representative to the UNESCO in Paris. Also, in the end, became good mates with Fraser. Died at age 98, being Australia's longest living Prime Minister. And that's number 3, Whitlam. Coming in at number 2, we have Keating. Paul Keating from 91 to 96. Working class Irish Catholic descent, then he left school at 14. His father was a boilermaker. In the end, was unimpressed by Hawke's attitude to policy, as Keating had to be careful of what he did, who it offended, and how it made him look, etc. Had a sense about him that he fought and scrapped his way up to the top. collects French antique clocks like a bell end, becomes Prime Minister in 1991 after beating Hawke in a leadership contest, becomes a hate figure to the British tabloids as Keating had a sense of anti-Britain about him, given he disliked the idea of class-ridden monarchical, antiquated, crumbling empire. Very keen to see the Queen removed as head of state from Australia and for it to become a republic. He says, Britain is the country which decided not to defend the Malayan Peninsula, not to worry about Singapore, and not give us our troops back to keep ourselves free from Japanese domination. The complete opposite of Robert Menzies. The British tabloids jump on him for touching the Queen. He was caught for a brief moment with his hands on the Queen's back. The tabloids of Britain, the absolute cunts, called him the Lizard of Oz, which is, to be fair to them, pretty good. Everyone says that it was disgraceful and typical Aussie behaviour trying to grope our dear Queen. I'd have killed her if it was me. Keating is quite good at giving it back though. Opposition leader John Hudson says to Keating, "Why won't you call an early election?" Keating replies, "The answer is, mate, I want to do you slyly." In the 80s, Keating says,
The leader of the opposition
is more to be pitied than to be despised. The poor old thing. The Liberal Party of Australia ought to put him down like a faithful old dog, but he is no use to it, and no use to the nation. He also said that he did not slither out of the cabinet room like a mangy maggot. Mangy, don't really know what that means. And he described Howard as a little desiccated coconut. Also incredibly rude about John Howard, saying, "I will never get to the stage of wanting to lead the nation, standing in front of the mirror every morning, clipping my eyebrows here and clipping my eyebrows there." And he called the Liberals a motley, dishonest crew, called the National Party dummies and dimwits, desperados. He said of another opposition politician, Peter Costello, that being attacked by him was like being flogged with warm lettuce. Overall, he's a sort of impressive and charismatic figure. Wins a 93 election against all of the odds. Focuses on Aboriginal rights in Australia. Prime Minister until 96, or he lose the election to John Howard, the little desiccated coconut with the big eyebrows. He is still kicking about it to this day and is very vocal. Recently said that Australia needs to focus on building relationships with Asia. That was number 2, Keating. Number 1, the GOAT in this arbitrary list, Hawke. Bob Hawke, from 1983 to 1991. The paradigm of an Australian Prime Minister. Square-jawed, craggy, and he loves a pint. And he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. Set the world record for downing a yard, which is 1.4 litres, of ale in 11 seconds at the Tough Tavern in Oxford. Legend! His father was a Congregationalist pastor, and Hawke was brought up in an atmosphere of religious intensity. His father told him that he should believe in the fatherland of God and that heaven was all around him, which Hawke goes on to believe. When he's a boy, his family often joke that he will be Prime Minister one day. He goes off to study law at the University of Western Australia. He's riding home one day on his motorbike and then suddenly crashes and spends days battling between life and death. His mother tells him that he's been spared and it's a sign of God's providence, to which he believes entirely. He decides to change his ways and not waste his life and do acts of good. However, this doesn't stop him drinking, as he actually gets alcohol poisoning in 1963. Loses his faith in Christianity, however, as he went to India with the World Conference of Christian Youth and was shocked that they were all having such a good time while the people of India were in immense poverty. Was a trade union leader during the Go Whitlam affair. Self-consciously patriotic, very anti-communist, pro-Western alliance, and similar to James Callaghan of Britain. Enters Parliament only 3 years before he becomes Prime Minister. Gives up drinking when he joins Parliament, but resumes after he leaves. Revives and intensifies a universal healthcare policy, but contrastingly acted very similar to what Thatcher was doing in Britain at this time. Floating the dollar, deregulating the economy, bringing down tariffs, bringing down barriers and opening the Australian economy to globalisation. He doesn't really like the British. Legislates to remove the last links to Britain and the former empire. By doing this, he does stuff like changing the national anthem. He has an attitude to the game where he believes he's got nothing to lose because he has proven to himself that he is good enough for the job. He has no hang-ups to stick to or worry about, and he does so what he likes willy-nilly. His deputy, however, Paul Keating, is not able to do this, so they have a bit of discourse. Nonetheless, together they turn Australia into the true leading country, and one in which the rest of the world pays attention to now. Australia is socially progressive and economically liberal, which establishes the template for third way politics, very well recognised with Blair's Britain. His deputy Keating stabs him in the back because they had an argument that once Hook was done, he would hand over the keys to Keating, which allows him to run the country, which he didn't stick to. Keating does a leadership challenge in the summer of 91, which he doesn't succeed in, but in the second challenge in December 91, he wins and Hawke resigns being Prime Minister. When he leaves he often would go to cricket grounds, watch cricket, down pints in front of fans for entertainment. And that, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, is the full list of the top 20 Australian Prime Ministers. This episode was 10 to 1, so I'll give it a little rundown. Number 10, we had Howard. Number 9, we had Holt. Number 8, we had Barton. Number 7, we had McMahon. Number 6, we had Menzies. Number 5, Curtin. Number 4, Shifley. Number 3, Whitlam. Number 2, Keating. And number 1, Hawke. Now, the full rundown, the top 20 in order. We had Fadden in 20. McEwen in 19, Gorton in 18, Turnbull in 17, Morrison in 16, Fraser in 15, Gillard in 14, Abbott in 13, Hughes in 12, Rudd in 11, Howard in 10, Holt in 9, Barton in 8, McMahon in 7, Menzies in 6, Curtin in 5, Shifley in 4, Whitlam in 3, Keating in 2, and Hawke in 1. Thank you so much for watching this very long video of the top 10 Australian Prime Ministers. And thank you if you watched the previous one, which helps to make this two-part series all 20. I have been helped very much by this man here, as he wrote all the facts you heard and did the ranking for me. His Instagram's in the description, as it is in the previous video. More videos like this to come, written by this man. So if you like this writing style, any ranking video from here is probably written by him, especially of politicians. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all the usual YouTube stuff. I've been Keyspoon, and I'll see you in the next one.